Could the struggles of Lewis Hamilton be compromising Mercedes for their plans for the future? In a manner which seems eerily similar to what happened at McLaren before his departure there? Yes, I know, you are readying your pitchfork, but when you're scripting at 4 AM with a newborn baby, you think very daring things. Now, before you think of words like sabotage or revenge, this isn't really the kind of video you're looking for. I'm trying to be fair here. What this video wishes to illustrate is that the woes of 2024 Mercedes were brought into sharp relief for me by the likes of Gary Anderson, one of the regular contributors to the race, and this piece on Crash.net concerning the recent experiments conducted by both Mercedes and Lewis, and it potentially having a knock-on effect for future seasons of Mercedes, and could maybe send it into a downward spiral where it has absolutely no clue as to what to do, even less clue than they have already. Presently, from what we can tell, Lewis is simply doing the best he can out of a bad situation, but what he is trying to do is just simply not working. And it's only further establishing the sentiments that he had at the beginning of the season, where this is the worst start to a season he's ever had. It's causing both he and his team to lose ground to McLaren and Ferrari, and now they're having to look over their shoulder to Aston Martin. So in regards to these struggles, does this mean that Lewis Hamilton is responsible for why Mercedes have fallen off so badly? Well, it depends. It's a bit of a group situation, as it were. I mean, of course, Lewis Hamilton leaving doesn't help, but also really Mercedes should have probably paid attention to Lewis Hamilton's struggles a little sooner. It's sort of a team effort, as it were, why they're not having a great time. And again, I am trying to be fair here, but what Gary said specifically in this tome here, it really struck a chord with me. Ahem. The Mercedes is generally inconsistent. This is all likely leading him astray, and Hamilton does not seem willing to accept the reality. Bit harsh there, but okay. There is a knock-on effect that hampers the car's development long-term too. If you make odd choices on setup, then a team fails to find a baseline for performance and setup. It limits learning about the car. If that is absent, then the development path, knowing what to work on in the wind tunnel and improving aerodynamic performance, will be confused too. It leaves a team with no positive direction. In the meantime, if he does not want to end this year as the second best Mercedes driver, he should look and learn from Russell, and simply take the best out of what he has to work with. Well, if you want to be really technical, Gary, if the McLarens end up beating Mercedes, and one of the Aston Martins does, then we could see maybe Lewis Hamilton being the 5th fastest Mercedes power driver. Oh. What Gary's trying to get at here is that Lewis right now, alongside the team, is trying to find a solution, scrabbling around for one, which is not really forthcoming, whilst Mercedes are also trying to figure out a solution at the same time, but albeit separately. But when it comes to the overall understanding of the W15, it's George who has the upper hand, because he's been driving mediocre cars throughout his entire Formula One career. He knows a dab hand or two at how to extract the living daylights out of a car which has barely anything to give. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that, but go and look at his form book where he's been. And this reminds me of the state of affairs that McLaren had in 2012, right in the middle of the era that the car's concept kept changing all the time, and right after Lewis left the team, the overall performance started to fall off even harder. Then it peaked at the Belgian Grand Prix, where he then just slapped some telemetry of McLaren on his own social media post, which McLaren got incredibly angry about. Sure, the technical director at the time, Paddy Lowe, said it didn't really damage the team all that much, but considering this was the realm of Ron Dennis where perfection is mandatory, yeah, that is a clear act of defiance. And it was all, in a way, you could say, a fit of pique from Lewis in trying to understand how the heck Jensen was so much better than him on the day. Because when you look back at that race, Jensen got pole and went on to win the Grand Prix, whereas Lewis, he could only manage 8th, about 8 or 9 tenths behind him, and then he really couldn't try and do any better because he was involved in the big crash, you know, the infamous one when Grosjean went flying and he got that race ban. The finer details of the telemetry are quite nuanced, but the summary from Malcolm Strachan is that Lewis couldn't believe how different the two wing configurations were between his and Button's car, as well as other places Lewis was losing time in. I'll leave a link to Malcolm's page in the description because his detailing is top notch. And in the early 2010s, it wasn't too bad. McLaren wasn't exactly slow. They could be competitive. They did have their moments. Both Jensen and Lewis could bag wins, but they never really had the complete package that could go for a full-on title hunt and be consistently right up there. There'd be peaks and troughs. 2010 probably being the best out of the situation that they had. 2012, It had its moments, and at some points it could easily be the fastest car. But then at the same time, Jensen would describe it as the worst McLaren he had ever driven. So you could tell that both drivers were struggling with a car that sometimes could be great, sometimes it could be terrible. How do you work with that kind of car where you have no idea how well it's going to perform on a given weekend? Oh, Jensen, my sweet 2012 Jensen. You had no idea what was coming with the MP430. So when you look back to the 2012 season in particular, even though it could be competitive at some circuits, both Jensen and Lewis were having trouble getting a really solid baseline, having to constantly change the setup, having good lucky moments, having really bad days, and therefore the team itself could really not get a good baseline in which to design a really good concept. There are talks and posts about that maybe Ron Dennis wanted to carry on with the 2012 car into 2013, but then Martin Whitmarsh, his longtime compatriot, insisted on having a brand new car, and therefore what we saw in 2013 happened, whereas actually it might have been slightly better had they carried on with the 2012 car and had a 2012B, like a B-spec thing, kind of like what they had in 2003 with the MP417D, and how good that was for the longest time. But yeah, it wasn't great at McLaren, and neither driver could really get heads or tails around that particular concept. McLaren were also loath to pick sides as to who was the lead driver. I don't think you need me to tell you why. History, including one spat that Lewis was involved in as well come 2007. Yeah, McLaren does not like confrontation. So the two driving styles of Jensen and Lewis are incredibly different. So McLaren's being pulled apart in different directions. Which way do you go? Which driver do you appeal to? Then you end up with appealing to neither of them. It can be great at some places, others it cannot, and therefore you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and good luck trying to go for a world title. In that situation, I think Lewis is partially to blame for the struggles of McLaren at the time, and when he left, it was just getting worse from there, but Jensen also had his fair share of responsibility as well. Let's just say that despite their credentials and both being world champions, when you put them both in the same car, they really aren't great at providing great feedback that is consistent and you can really evolve from. Hence, when I saw Gary Anderson's thoughts at 4 o'clock in the morning, completely sleep deprived, I just remembered that time of McLaren. It was just like, there must be a connection. Right now, Lewis is looking for a way to find a cure-all for the W15. He's trying to look deep within his own vast well of experience to locate a possible setup tweak that can instantly fix the car and make it quick again before the next noticeable upgrade arrives for the Miami Grand Prix. But, as Gary Anderson mentions, in particular as described on Crash.net, there are only so many things you can change in the car's setup that can really make a difference on that particular weekend. That being the ride height, spring stiffness, and front and rear wing aerodynamic balances. And if you partake in sim racing, you probably are very well aware that sometimes when it comes to setups, you can be tweaking tiny little things over and over and over again, for hours in fact, just to try and get that slight bit of improvement. You might find something really good, or you find yourself completely going away from where you started, you then have to go all the way back again, losing hours and hours of time. And that's when you have a game when you can spend hours and hours on. These professional racing drivers only have 1 or 2 sessions in which to find a setup. That might be what Lewis is going through himself, as he had admitted to changing setups between the sprint and the race for the Chinese Grand Prix. But I can't see why he did it though. As far as he was concerned, on Saturday, he realised that he'd hit the jackpot. He'd bucked the trend. He got a podium in the sprint. He was on the front row. That was fantastic. Finally, something had clicked. So why don't you then just go, okay, this worked. Maybe if I just go a little bit further in that direction, it might be even better. But then Lewis didn't take into account the rigours of qualifying and the fact that Nico Rosberg was in the commentary box, and thusly, he locked up into the hairpin after the very long straight, and he lost so much time he went out in Q1, and a situation where Toto was quite willing to adamantly point the finger at Lewis for the reason why they didn't do so well. Him and the team already aware that the W15 is, as Wolf would put it, not an okay car. The struggle is real, my friend. Mercedes are struggling hard. They, as well as Lewis, are refusing to accept the reality of the situation, that the W15 isn't a fully amazing car, and that it's going to take time to fix. And then they've got a driver in Lewis who is trying desperately to then find the time to fix the car himself, but he's limited into what he can actually do. And even if they do bring a Miami upgrade that might do better, there's no guarantee it'll work because, as we've seen, the correlation between the wind tunnel and the racetrack for Mercedes over the last couple of years has been woefully inconsistent. We've been spoiled by McLaren's upgrades being perfect every single time. Haas's upgrades are better than Mercedes's because they're faster on the track than they are in the wind tunnel. That's bonkers. How does that even happen? All the while, George is just getting on with his own weekend and is 14 points clear ahead of his teammate. Whilst his comments aren't glowing of the car either, they are a little more positive and analytical, which does follow the Mercedes part of the line of oversharing and basically detailing everything to within the minutiaest of minutiae, something that James Vowles has taken over to Williams. But at the same time, I can listen to James Vowles talk all day about just about anything. Look, I may be oversimplifying the matter. I'm a professional yapper who lives on his ladder 24/7 and will refuse to have his hair cut, mainly for the fact that sometimes I do like to troll you just a little bit. From what I see, Mercedes just don't look solid. The car just does not look solid. There are moments where it could be okay. George can get something out of it, and as we saw in the Chinese sprint, Lewis can get something out of it, then it tends to disappear all over again in a fit of excitement. Lewis gets overexcited and giddy, changes something, and then it can be completely off again. I don't think I've ever seen a car go that badly off due to a major setup change that quickly. And also, the relationship between Lewis and the team is crumbling by the race. If Toto's not pulling his punches anymore, then that's a really bad sign. You would have never heard comments such as that from the boss a few years ago. Heck, you wouldn't have heard that from Toto about Lewis a year ago. With Lewis moving on to pastures new, it's quite clear that there is going to be a sort of breaking of the bonds that they've built over the last decade, that slowly but surely, Lewis and the team will part company, and therefore it's going to be a very messy divorce. And that's something he's admitted that he's not looking forward to, having that awkward conversation with Toto about what are they going to do, what meetings will he be expected to attend, and which ones he can skip. It's something that Lewis has really never had to experience before. At least not for a very long time. When that happened at McLaren, he was being iced out. But again, it's a very long time. 2012 to him is a lifetime ago. Whereas now it's happening all over again at a team he expected to retire at and have an ambassadorial role, stay there for the rest of his life. Now that's not happening. I mean, Lewis isn't a special case or anything. This is something that happens to every outgoing driver. Maybe that experience he had at McLaren, it's still quite raw to him. But this is Lewis we're talking about here. Are Mercedes really going to isolate him right now? Especially when they really got to try and stop Aston Martin from beating them? They are going to give the man that bestowed them multiple world championships all the time possible that they can give. And also, he's the man that's responsible for increasing the value of that F1 team by as much as $2 billion. Although admittedly, quite a lot of that value will disappear over to Ferrari once he does leave, because, you know, the Hamilton factor, it is real. And maybe that's another reason why Toto's upset by the whole affair, because his wealth is intrinsically linked to the value of Mercedes because he's a major shareholder, and effectively, Lewis leaving to go to Ferrari could cost him hundreds of millions of dollars. Yes, I know that's not how shares work because he's not sold the shares, but intrinsically, the value of his assets has gone down drastically and will continue to do so. But this deference might come back to bite them if they continue to give Lewis all the time they need, and if they don't act tough and start to focus on George's inputs more and more, since he does have a contract with the team for next year and Lewis doesn't, then this could make what Gary Anderson said come true, that Mercedes just have a concept which is incredibly weak, it's incredibly divided, they have no direction. And then going into 2026, it'll just get even worse. They'll have lost so much ground. But then Gunther Steiner made me think, maybe Lewis and Mercedes would have come to a deal at some point had Fred Vasseur not gone to Ferrari, and Ferrari hadn't dropped a big pile of money on Lewis's desk. So if that hadn't have happened, then maybe the board and he might have come up with a compromise. It wouldn't have been ideal, but Lewis would have still been at Mercedes. If the team keeps appeasing Lewis, or Lewis doesn't just, as Gary Anderson says, accept reality, or look and learn from what George is doing, then this downward spiral could get even worse to the point where in 2025, when Kimi Antonelli comes in, the team might find themselves closer to the likes of Racing Bulls, and maybe Aston Martin being well ahead of them, and then that's going to make Kimi Antonelli look incredibly silly, because he can barely score points, and that would have been through no fault of his own. If that happens and Kimi Antonelli sinks, and then Toto is responsible for it, then that might be the thing that sees him no longer being the team principal at Mercedes, that he would be asked to step down. Yeah, I think Toto is betting the farm on Kimi, and that's incredibly not fair for the young man. But throughout all of this, Mercedes will have less time to properly gain data for the long-term improvement of the car, since both George and Lewis will be going in different directions, and Lewis will be focusing on its own race rather than the team's future recovery. But can you blame them though? Why should he care about Mercedes anymore? They are the team that denied him what he wanted, a 3-year racing deal, and then a 10-year ambassadorial role, and him effectively being tied down to Mercedes for life. His entire professional career from the age of 13 would have been powered by one engine supplier, and that is huge for Mercedes in terms of branding power. But now, that's not happening. Ferrari will be remembered, if Lewis does well there, as the person that brought so much success, bringing them their first world title since Kimi Räikkönen. And then you hear on the grapevine, supposedly, that one of your greatest rivals in your entire F1 career might have a way to get into your old team. That Toto and the board are more than happy to drop a 9-figure sum for their services, give them an ambassadorial role. All the things that Lewis was denied would be given to Max, hypothetically according to rumour. That would be incredibly galling and incredibly reduce the morale and inclination for you to do the best for that team. You'd be thinking, why would I even bother? It would be a bitter pill to swallow, understandably. And Lewis for the longest time has been used to being the boss of a team, having the constant reassurance that he is the one that they would listen to. And for good reason, because he's been successful throughout his entire career. He has the experience, he has the credentials to be listened to and taken seriously. But now, through the struggles of the ground effect era at Mercedes, that reputation and that standing has been diminished. He's not had a race win since Saudi Arabia 2021. If he had won that sprint race in China, then that might have made things all the different. The apathy is starting to descend in his post-race interviews. The gazes are headed toward Ferrari's direction, since the car is fundamentally better than the one he's currently got. Even though Gary Anderson might not be thinking it, this is giving Lewis all the more fuel to not really put in as much of an effort for Mercedes, or instead focus on his own race to really showcase his talents off to Ferrari that, hey, I can make a really mediocre car sing and dance and really outperform it. Do what Fernando Alonso did in 2012 for Ferrari. I can do the same for you. Even though the current Ferrari is actually really good and could easily be described as the second fastest car, where you cannot describe the Mercedes as that. When you look at those interviews, he's just sort of given up. He's realizing that, yeah, the car's not really that good, and I've got to really try everything in my arsenal to try and get the best out of it. And therefore, you lose time in fundamental setup changes and not realizing that, hey, listen, Lewis, just chill out. The car is fundamentally flawed. Let the bods over at Brackley fix it, and then maybe this Miami upgrade might be better, and they might continue to get better, and therefore you just follow the baseline setup and then go from there, try and get the best you can. Whereas Lewis is just trying everything, and it's just losing time, and therefore losing points. But then I remember what happened with Sebastian Vettel in 2020. He got unceremoniously dropped from Ferrari, but you didn't really hear him complain. He was shocked and hurt by it, but he promised to give the best that he could for his team, and he relatively stayed in good grace. He did the best he could, he provided as much feedback as he could, even though he did have a really torrid year in comparison to his teammate. I mean, I have no idea how the SF1000 got a podium that year, but then you saw Ferrari eventually improve, which then resulted in 2022 Ferrari having a really good car, even though it did have a very fragile engine. But Charles and Sebastian were united in finding a solution for their team, whereas George and Lewis are not really that united. Perhaps the changes for Miami might improve Mercedes' lot, and Lewis does toe the line with the overall setup guidelines. But if Lewis continues to fight on with his own direction, really trying to promote his own wares and services to Ferrari, instead of looking at the overall future of Mercedes, just thinking of the here and now, what might work for that race in particular, instead of what might work for the W16 in 2025, then I could easily see Mercedes just falling down further and further. Sure, George's feedback's there, it's all very well and good, but then you got Lewis's feedback, and you've been listening to Lewis for a very long time. He's very successful. You've got to take that to heart as well, so you're then torn. And then all of that stuff that happened with McLaren, it'll just come crawling back again. But at the same time, why should Lewis care? Why should he? Because this is the team that betrayed him. But at the same time, you're doing a job. You are racing for a team. They are still your team right now. Surely you would want to end that era of your career on a high. But at the same time though, desperation is reeking from both Lewis and Mercedes. They don't know what to do, and it's really disappointing, considering how good they used to be. I kind of feel sorry for Mercedes in a way. They probably have no idea what to do. Sure, they should have listened to Lewis sooner and really had a good understanding of what might work best for him, and then George could adapt to it. But then even now, with supposedly that being the case with the W15, it's still slow. So I don't know what they can do, except just continue to evolve and stick with it, and then maybe try their luck again in 2026, as is every other team. If they don't, then we can easily see a situation like McLaren had in 2013, and the overall direction of the team gets sent into a downward trajectory that could keep the team in the midfield and give Toto a minor aneurysm. But hey, one good thing might come out of this. Toto might have absolutely no qualms in putting an 18-year-old Italian driver in the second seat and not have to worry about people thinking, are you absolutely mad? Because right now, if you'll try anything, but Again, if this does fail, then I could easily see Toto's career coming to a screeching halt. That and probably denying Carlos Sainz another frontline seat, but perhaps that's for the best for the Spaniard. You can watch this video next to find out why I think Sainz shouldn't really bother going to Mercedes, because the future would not be looking at him. Not at all.